Winter came to Squaw Valley like an unwelcome guest, dumping snow on the secluded corners of mountains and valleys. The wind howling in the tops of the pines sounded as if nature itself was complaining about its harshness. Henry McCain's cabin, lonely and covered with a layer of frost, stood on the edge of the silent, snowy wasteland, like a forgotten toy in a child's game. Henry, a tall man with silver streaks in his dark hair, sat by the crackling fireplace. His fingers mechanically embraced a cup of hot tea, but his gaze was fixed on the same spot on the floor, the spot where his wife Kate's favorite chair once stood. Even now, 2 years after her death, the emptiness in the room seemed louder than all the sounds of winter outside. The wind outside intensified. A loud howl seeped through the cracks in the wooden walls. Henry sighed and reached for his old jacket when a faint sound came from behind the thick windows. He froze. It wasn't the howl of the wind, not the creak of wood. The sound was higher, distinctly alive, and almost resembled a cry. Henry frowned, trying to convince himself that it was just a strange whim of the blizzard. But the sound repeated, this time closer. It was a scream, full of despair, and it lingered in the air like a final cry for help. Henry stood up. The jacket was old and lost from time, but it should protect him from the biting cold. Grabbing the lantern from the hook, he paused at the door. The thought of going out into the night, into the cold and the unknown, made his heart beat faster, but the sound cut through the silence again. He opened the door, and the frost immediately rushed into the cabin, burning his face. The snow fell in thick flakes, and the light of the lantern seemed dim amidst this icy veil. Henry took a step forward, then another, leaving deep tracks in the untouched snow. The scream grew louder. It came from somewhere along the path leading to the old bridge over the frozen stream. Henry made his way through the snowdrifts. Each step was hard for him. In his head, a thought kept spinning. What if this is a trap? What if it's an animal pretending, luring prey? But he kept walking. Something inside wouldn't let him stop. At the edge of the little bridge, he saw it. A small dark spot, barely visible in the lantern light, lay motionless. Henry approached. His breath came out in clouds of steam when he made out the creature. It was a bear cub. Its tiny body was shivering, its paws almost hidden under a layer of frost, and its eyes dimly gleamed, barely open. God, Henry whispered, kneeling down. His heart painfully tightened. The bear cub let out a weak squeak, as if a final desperate breath before giving up. Henry hesitated for a second. This was a wild animal. Intervention could be dangerous, even deadly, but he remembered Kate's face, her voice when she said, "We must help, even if we are afraid." "You won't die here, little one," Henry said firmly. He took off his scarf and carefully wrapped the bear cub in it. A weak growl, more like a whimper, sounded in response. But the animal was too weak to resist. Its weight was insignificant, but this fragility, like an ice crystal in his hands, shook Henry. The snow became even thicker, and returning to the cabin was harder than walking along the path. The wind cut through the skin, but Henry held the bear cub close to him, protecting it from the elements. When he finally returned, his hands were numb from the cold. Inside the cabin, the warmth was almost unbearable after the icy air. Henry carefully placed the bear cub on an old woolen blanket by the fireplace. The slight movement of its paws indicated that it was still alive. Henry hurried to put a bowl of water by the fire, then brought the remains of bread and honey. He knew it wasn't enough, but at the moment, it was the best he could offer. The bear cub seemed to understand his intentions. Its eyes met Henry's, full of quiet pleading. "You're strong," Henry said softly, sitting down next to it. "You'll survive." That night, Henry didn't go to bed. He kept watch by the fireplace, watching every movement of the bear cub. The warmth and the rhythm of the little creature's breath filled the cabin with something that hadn't been there since Kate's death. Hope. Morning came slowly, as if nature hesitated whether to give in to the blizzard. Pale dawn light filtered through the frosted windows of the cabin, illuminating Henry, still sitting by the fireplace. His back ached from the uncomfortable position in the old chair, but he paid no attention to it. His gaze was fixed on the little creature curled up on the blanket. The bear cub looked a bit better. Its fur was now dry, and in the faint light it shimmered with a soft chocolate hue. The breathing was even without the previous raspy tremor that had frightened Henry at night. He sat closer and carefully ran his fingers along the little bear's back. It twitched weakly, but didn't try to run away. Henry smiled. "Good morning, little one," he muttered. "You survived." He brought the bowl of water closer, hoping the creature would find the strength to touch it. At first, the bear cub just looked at it. Its eyes seemed deeper than such a small creature could hold, filled with a mix of distrust and fatigue. But after a few minutes, it cautiously stretched out a paw and then licked the water. It was a small miracle, but Henry felt his heart warm up. "That's it. You'll make it," he said, as if reassuring himself. The day outside dragged on in a gray streak. The wind had weakened, but the snow still slowly settled, covering the world with a new layer of silence. Henry spent the morning in chores that had long been absent from his life. He rummaged in the pantry to find something nutritious for the bear cub, ground oat flakes, adding a little honey, and placed the bowl on the warm floor by the fireplace. "It's not a luxurious breakfast, but it will be enough for you," he muttered, watching the reaction. The bear cub hesitated, as if struggling with inner instincts, but hunger won out. It leaned toward the bowl, first cautiously licking its contents, and then with visible pleasure began to eat. Henry couldn't help but smile, feeling an odd relief inside. However, the joy didn't last long. By noon, Henry, while removing the blanket, noticed spots of frozen blood on the bear cub's paws. His fingers trembled as he took one of the little paws and examined it closer. Tiny cuts from frostbite sliced through the tender skin. "Damn, little one. You've been through a lot," he muttered, sighing. Henry knew that just sitting and watching wasn't enough. He took out the old first aid kit, the same one he and Kate used for emergencies. Finding antiseptic and soft cloth, he began to treat the wounds. The bear cub first tried to break free, but its strength left it too quickly to resist. "Hold on," Henry said softly. "You're strong. You'll make it." By the time he finished, his hands were tired, and sweat beaded on his forehead. But the sight of the bear cub's bandaged paws brought a sense of small victory. He laid the animal back on the blanket by the fireplace and sat down next to it. "You're almost as good as new," he said with a warm smile. By evening, the cabin was again filled with the sounds of life. The bear cub, whom Henry began to call Lucky, gradually regained strength. It tried to stand on its paws, although it looked more like an awkward struggle with the blanket. Henry watched it with pride, as if it were a child's first step. When Lucky finally stood up, it took a couple of wobbly steps and immediately fell. Henry laughed. For the first time in many months, this sound echoed in the walls of his home. "You're just stubborn," he said, picking up the bear cub and laying it back on the blanket. "But that's good. Stubbornness will help you survive." That night, Henry settled back in the chair by the fireplace. The warmth and Lucky's soft breath filled the room with a coziness that had long been absent from his life. He felt something strange, almost forgotten. It wasn't just relief that Lucky had survived. It was a feeling of hope, quiet but insistent. Before closing his eyes, Henry looked at the bear cub curled up by the fire. "We'll survive, Lucky," he said softly, almost in a whisper. "Both of us." Outside the window, the winter raged, but inside the cabin, a spark of warmth was born, promising not to go out. The snow continued to fall, as if the forest wanted to hide everything that didn't fit into its quiet, harsh order. Henry's cabin stood like an island of warmth in this boundless white ocean, but inside it, a struggle was growing. Not only for the life of the little bear cub, but also for the heart of a man who had been hiding from himself for so long. Henry woke up early. The faint morning sun barely filtered through the frosted windows. He stretched, feeling the ache in his back after a night in the old chair, and immediately looked at Lucky. The bear cub lay on the blanket, its small body rhythmically rising and falling. The breathing was stronger, more even, and for the first time since their meeting, there was life in it. Henry allowed himself to smile, but this smile quickly faded, replaced by oppressive silence. He hadn't felt what it was like to care for someone, to be needed by someone, for a long time. The last time was with Kate. That day, he couldn't get her out of his head. Her voice sounded so clear, as if she were sitting right in front of him. "You were always good with those who needed you, Henry," she said in his thoughts. But along with that came another memory, her frail, sick body in the hospital bed. The last words he said to her still burned inside him. "I won't cope without you." And here he was, proving that maybe he was right. Henry shook his head, trying to get rid of that image. He got up and began his morning rituals, filled the kettle with water, checked the supply of firewood, and looked at Lucky again. The bear cub was already sitting, its paws still trembling, but it looked at Henry with an expression that was hard to describe. It was the look of a creature that hadn't yet learned to trust but couldn't help but hope. "You're making me work, little one," Henry said, deliberately cheerful, hiding his thoughts. "But never mind, we'll cope." During the day, Henry decided to try to take Lucky outside the cabin. He knew that sooner or later the bear cub would have to return to its element, and every move towards this was important. But this thought seemed unbearable. How could he be alone again? He wrapped Lucky in an old jacket and carefully carried it to the porch. The cold air hit his face, but the light was bright, almost blinding after the gloomy cabin. Lucky pressed against him, as if to the only source of warmth, its little paws trembling on the snow. "Here's your world," Henry said softly, putting the bear cub on the ground. "Get used to it." At first, Lucky stood still. Its nose twitched, catching new smells. Henry watched as it took its first uncertain step, then another. Each of its steps was a small victory, but Henry couldn't shake the oppressive feeling. He was preparing it to leave. Lucky went a little further, its small paws leaving barely noticeable tracks on the white snow. It sniffed the branches, explored every smell, but after a few minutes, it turned around and hurried back to Henry. He squatted, taking it back into his arms. "Well done, little one," he said, stroking the animal's fur. "You're learning." In the evening, Henry sat by the fireplace. Lucky settled at his feet. It seemed that at this moment everything around was still, leaving them alone. Henry wanted to focus on the warmth of this moment, but his thoughts returned to Kate. He remembered how they cared for an injured sparrow they found on the side of the road. Kate laughed, watching the little bird struggle out of its makeshift nest. "You know how to be kind, even if you don't always show it," she said then, her smile brighter than any sun. Now her words sounded different. They were a challenge. Henry felt the walls he had so carefully built around himself beginning to crumble. Lucky, this tiny, dependent creature, reminded him that life, no matter how fragile, always deserved a chance. "You are my redemption mission," he muttered, looking at the bear cub. That night, for the first time in a long time, Henry allowed himself to fall asleep, not out of fatigue, but with a sense of humility. Lucky, curled up at his feet, became a symbol of something more than just rescue. It became a symbol of a chance for restoration. And somewhere deep down, Henry felt that he too was learning to trust. The morning began with frozen calm. The forest around Henry's cabin looked almost unnaturally quiet, as if nature was holding its breath. The snow was no longer falling, but a thick frost covered the trees and the ground, giving everything a shine and a sense of cold alienation at the same time. Henry, as always, woke up first. His body had gradually gotten used to constant night vigilance, and the habit of checking on Lucky had become a reflex. The bear cub was no longer just lying on the blanket by the fireplace. It was playing with a piece of old cloth that Henry had left for it as a toy. "You're starting to get used to this life, huh?" Henry said with a smile, watching Lucky tug at the cloth with its little paws. But behind that smile hid anxiety. Henry knew that this little cabin couldn't be a permanent refuge for Lucky, and the more he became attached to the bear cub, the more he realized the inevitability of the upcoming separation. That day, Henry decided to go into the forest. The weather was surprisingly clear, and he understood that he needed to take advantage of this moment to replenish his supplies. Lucky stayed at the cabin, and although the thought of leaving it alone caused Henry anxiety, he reassured himself that he had left the bear cub a warm corner and food. The snow crunched under his feet as he walked through the dense thicket, checking the traps he had set a few days earlier. The forest seemed to come alive after the blizzard. The shadows of the trees danced on the snow, and the faint rustle of birds' wings broke the silence. But behind these sounds hid something else, something that made Henry freeze. It was a low, almost rhythmic crackling of branches. He slowly turned his head toward the line of trees, and his heart stopped. At the edge of the clearing stood a bear, not as small as Lucky, but an adult, massive animal, its black fur gleaming in the sunlight. The bear stood still, as if examining Henry. For a second, tension hung between them, thick enough to cut with a knife. Henry knew what to do. He didn't make any sudden movements. His breathing became slow and shallow. He knew that an encounter with such an animal could turn into a catastrophe, especially if it felt threatened. But instead of attacking, the bear snorted, turned around, and disappeared into the dense underbrush. Henry remained standing until his heart slowly returned to its normal rhythm. He knew this was a warning. The forest was no longer just his. When he returned to the cabin, Lucky was sitting by the door, its nose twitching, catching the scent that Henry had brought with him. "I don't know if you feel it, but this place is becoming dangerous," he muttered, leaning down to pet Lucky. The bear cub wagged its tail, as if confirming his fears. Henry straightened up and began to inspect the cabin. He reinforced the windows, closed the weak spots in the door, and even gathered a temporary barrier of tree trunks and rope around the porch. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Henry didn't want to admit to himself that these actions were more directed at protecting Lucky than himself. But the thought that the little creature could become a victim of predators forced him to act. In the evening, Henry decided it was time to start teaching Lucky to defend itself. He found a piece of cloth, tied it to a stick, and began playing with the bear cub, moving the toy across the floor. "You have to be strong, little one," he said, watching Lucky first hesitate and then, drawn by the movement, try to catch the cloth. Instincts took over. Lucky began to jump on the toy, grabbing it with its little jaws. Its movements were awkward, but there was hidden strength in them. Henry felt a sense of pride growing inside him. "That's it. That's the right attitude," he gently encouraged. But even this moment couldn't drown out the oppressive thought that had haunted him all day. Lucky couldn't stay here for long. The forest was full of threats, and with each encounter with wild nature, this became clearer. That night, as the fire in the fireplace began to die down, Henry sat watching Lucky, who was already asleep at his feet. The world seemed so quiet, but this silence hid many dangers. "We'll figure it out," he muttered, as if reassuring himself. "Step by step." His voice trembled, and at that moment he realized that he was afraid not only for Lucky, but also for himself. This bear cub had become a part of his life, and the thought of being alone again was unbearable. Outside the window, the wind howled, but inside the cabin, there was life. For the first time in many years, Henry felt not just alive, but needed. Spring began to cautiously make its way into the forest, like a shy guest. The snow no longer fell with its former fury, and the rare rays of the sun reflected off the melting snowdrifts, creating shimmering light. Henry's cabin stood as a testament to the harsh winter, survived with determination and hope. But within its walls, a different mood prevailed. It was time to make the decision that Henry had been putting off for so long. Lucky was growing, gaining strength and confidence. Its steps were now firm, its movements graceful. It was no longer that helpless, frozen bear cub that Henry had found at the doorstep. But with each passing day, Henry understood. He couldn't keep it here any longer. The forest was calling Lucky, and this call was growing stronger. That morning, Henry made a decision. He knew that Lucky needed a chance to live as it was meant to, in the wild among its kind. The night passed restlessly. Henry sat by the fire for a long time, pondering how to say goodbye. These words seemed stuck in his throat. In the morning, he packed a small backpack. In it were the remains of supplies, a blanket, and a few pieces of venison that he carefully wrapped. Henry decided to take Lucky to the reserve on the other side of the ridge, where animals could live in relative safety, away from hunters and threats. When he brought Lucky to the doorstep, the bear cub seemed to understand that something had changed. Its large dark eyes met Henry's, full of sadness and determination. "You've grown, little one," Henry said, squatting next to it. His voice was soft, but it trembled. "You're strong, you're ready." Lucky tilted its head as if trying to understand. It made a soft sound, something between a growl and a whimper, and pressed against Henry's hand. "Don't make this harder than it is," he muttered, barely holding back tears. "This is right. You understand?" You belong to the forest. The journey to the reserve was long. Henry and Lucky walked side by side, the forest becoming less harsh as they progressed. The ground was visible in places from under the snow, and the trees looked livelier than they had in the past few months. Lucky curiously sniffed the new smells, sometimes stopping to explore the trail. Henry walked slowly, giving it time. When they reached the border of the reserve, Henry stopped. Before him stretched an open meadow, beyond which began the dense forests marked by bright ribbons indicating the reserve's territory. Henry knew that beyond this line, Lucky would be safe. He knelt down next to the bear cub and placed the backpack on the ground. "Here is your home," he said, his voice trembling. "Here you will find your place." Lucky looked at him as if trying to understand why it was being left. Henry gently stroked its head. "You saved me, Lucky. More than I saved you," he said softly. "Now you have to go on." He stepped back, forcing himself to look away. Lucky froze, its paws trembling, but a moment later, it slowly moved forward. It stopped at the edge of the meadow and looked back. Their eyes met, and Henry felt something inside him tear. "Goodbye, little one," he whispered. When Lucky disappeared behind the trees, Henry stood there for a long time. The forest around him was filled with the sounds of life, but he felt completely alone. The journey back to the cabin was the longest he had ever taken. Each step echoed in his heart with emptiness. But upon returning, he realized his loneliness was different. It was not emptiness, but space for something new. The cabin was no longer a prison to him. It had become a place where he found hope, where he learned to feel again. Henry sat by the fireplace, opening a notebook that had long been forgotten. He began to write, the words flowing from him easily and freely. He wrote about Lucky, about the winter that brought him salvation. "You'll make it out there," he whispered, looking towards the forest. The words he wrote were not just about the bear cub. They were about himself. Time passed, and the forest around Squaw Valley changed with the coming of spring. The snow melted, revealing the earth full of life. Birds filled the air with songs, streams rang like silver strings, and the trees came alive with fresh greenery. For Henry McCain, all this was a reminder that life does not stand still, even if it seems like you are stuck. Several months had passed since he took Lucky to the reserve. At first, the cabin seemed frighteningly empty. His steps echoed across the floor. The silence was deafening. But gradually, Henry found a way to fill this emptiness. He wrote. His notebook, once covered in dust, was now filled with stories about the bear cub, about the winter that changed his life, and about what it means to let go. One clear autumn day, Henry stepped out onto the cabin porch, as usual, with a cup of coffee in his hands. The air was fresh, with a slight aroma of damp earth and fallen leaves. He thoughtfully looked at the forest, trying to imagine how Lucky was living now. Perhaps it had found its pack, become strong and independent. But something interrupted his thoughts. A rustle. Henry froze, his heart beating faster. He peered into the trees. At first it was just movement, barely noticeable among the autumn shadows. Then a figure emerged from behind the bushes. It was a bear. Henry initially froze, not knowing how to react. But then he realized it was Lucky, no longer that small and fragile bear cub he had found at his doorstep. Lucky had grown. Its fur was thick, shiny. It moved confidently, like a creature that knew who it was and where its place in this world was. But that wasn't all. Behind it, a little uncertainly, walked another bear cub. Small, barely visible from behind the adult bear's paws, it peeked out from behind Lucky, as if seeking protection. Henry felt his breath catch. This was impossible. Lucky had become a father. Lucky stopped at the edge of the meadow, its dark eyes meeting Henry's, full of understanding and gratitude. They stood like that, man and bear, connected by a moment that seemed eternal. Henry carefully squatted, making no sudden movements. He wanted to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. All he could do was smile. Lucky made a soft sound, something between a growl and a grumble, and nudged its bear cub forward. The little creature came a bit closer, but still hesitated, staying close to its father. "You made it, little one," Henry finally whispered, barely holding back tears. "You really made it." The meeting was short. Lucky and its bear cub lingered on the meadow, as if showing Henry that they were doing well. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they turned around and disappeared into the forest, their silhouettes blending into the shadows of the trees. Henry remained standing, feeling a strange mix of emotions: joy, pride, sadness. But more than anything, he felt satisfaction. Lucky had shown him that every end is just the beginning of something new. That night, Henry sat by the fireplace with an open notebook. The words came easily, as if someone was guiding his hand. He wrote about the connection that had changed his life, about how a little bear cub helped him cope with pain and reminded him that there is always hope, even in the darkest corners of life. When he finished, the fire in the fireplace had almost gone out, leaving the room in the soft glow of embers. Henry closed the notebook and leaned back in his chair. His gaze was fixed on the window, where the moonlight illuminated the treetops. "Thank you, Lucky," he whispered into the silence. Outside the window, the wind howled, but instead of emptiness, it brought a sense of completion. Henry smiled, feeling that this was not the end. It was a new chapter, and he was ready to write it.